You are indeed watching Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side Live. I'm one of your hosts, Eugene Puryear, here as always, alongside Rania Khalek. Rania, as always, good to be back with you.
Good to be back with you, Eugene. Good show we've got tonight.
We've got a great show. Well, yeah, I mean, obviously good is relative. We're going to be getting even more into the current conflict in Ukraine, but I would say good in the sense that we hope it'll be very informative for you, for those who are watching. So as always, in the beginning of the show, we'd like to remind you to hit that share button so whoever's following you can follow us. So again, make sure you share that on whatever platform you're watching. If you're watching on YouTube, please hit subscribe and also hit the bell so you can get the alerts. We have quite a bit coming out. Rania, you've already done some great interviews for Dispatches. We have the Socialist program that's been coming out a lot on this. So there are many very important stories around the world, and we don't want to take away from any of that, but we are trying to do as much as we can regarding the current crisis and war in Europe, and we'll continue to follow it, cover it, put out interviews from, a range of different views, or at least within reason. So go ahead and subscribe, hit that bell if you're on YouTube. If you're not on YouTube, feel free to go and do the same thing. And again, wherever you're watching, please go ahead and hit that share button. And as always, you can put things in the super chat. You can donate. And Rania, our censor, it's a little fraught calling you a censor right now, but that's the role you're playing.
Right.
We'll determine whether or not it gets read on air, if it meets her standards, which of course are not laid out anywhere for any of us to know what they are, but they are discerning. That much I can say.
Completely arbitrary, how I feel at a given moment.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah.
So, yes, please. And obviously, you have to have a little levity in the midst of so many serious things. But,
yes.
Yeah, we are here once again, Rania. Obviously, at the top of the hour here, just for those who are not, constantly following the news, I know not everyone can do that. The state of things now, I would say the biggest piece of news so far is in the negotiations that are taking place in Belarus between Ukraine and Russia. Not that much was agreed on today in their talks, but one important thing was agreed on, and that is the humanitarian corridors. We know that there are a number of people who are trying to leave the country. The UN reporting 1 million people have fled already. There is confusion around how exactly you could leave, and who knows how it's going to go now, but it does seem that the two sides have reached an agreement on a humanitarian corridor. And as you can see between Rania and I, that is the New York Times map of the nature of who controls what territory. The red, pink, I don't know exactly how we want to say that color, those are essentially areas controlled by Russia and their allied forces from the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic. And the white essentially are areas that continue to be controlled by the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian military. As you can see there, very relatively similar to the past few days. The city of Kherson, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, in the south, first major city to fall to Russia, and they've made some other progress, moving towards the east in the Sea of Azov, mainly controlled by Russia. Certainly the Black Sea, heavily controlled by Russia. There were reports that the Russian naval forces are moving slightly up the Dnieper River from the Black Sea and moving to take some of the other port towns. And then you can see there in the north, still relatively stalemated in the northeast, if you want to call it that, over the past few days. And for those who may have seen it, the very long Russian convoy you may have seen in Belarus is still stalled there. And of course, you can see sort of in the middle of the map there, that little kind of triangle, almost look like it's pointing at Kiev. That's obviously Kiev there. And the situation there continues to be, sort of, it's siege is not the quite way to say it, but it's semi-surrounded. There's fighting happening in the suburbs there of Kiev. And there are, a number of rocket attacks, missile attacks, air attacks happening from both sides all across that map. There have been credible reports of certainly Ukrainian shells in Donetsk, and of course Russian and DPR artillery in Ukraine. So the civilian toll is continuing to increase. I don't really want to quote any numbers. There's a lot of fog of war around where it is. But I think let's just suffice it to say that it's a very very tough conflict right now, and it's a very tough situation, I think, for civilians, and I think on both sides it seems like people are fighting and dying, that's for sure. So, if we get something more reliable, we'll bring it to you, but I don't really want to speculate in what's becoming sort of a media game here about the numbers, but it's not good, obviously. War is not good, but that's more or less where it stands as of now. I don't know, Ronnie, if there's anything you wanted to add in terms of, the current situation.
No, I think that was like a great on the ground, just objective overview of what's taking place. And I just want to emphasize what you just said about war. I mean, this is a terrible situation. This is why war should be avoided at all costs. And it's very unfortunate that those with the power to de-escalate this conflict have not only failed to even try to de-escalate, they've done quite the opposite. They've actually escalated and provoked further. But anyways, we'll get to that.
Yeah. Well, one thing that you pointed out to me, Rania, and we'll get to this clip in just a second, but it's the question of like where things are going, how long this conflict could go. I mean, we know that just before the State of the Union, for instance, members of Congress were reporting that the Biden administration was reporting to them that this thing could last for decades in some way, which, was pretty eye-opening to me. But Rania, you pointed me to a clip of Hillary Clinton sort of speaking about this exact thing, right? About sort of where the conflict could potentially go. And we want to bring up this clip of Hillary. I think she might have been on ABC. I can't remember exactly where, but discussing, a number of things, but about sort of what the direction of the conflict could end up being.
But remember, the Russians invaded Afghanistan back in 1980. And although no country went in, they certainly had a lot of countries supplying arms and advice and even some advisors to those who were recruited to fight Russia. It didn't end well for the Russians. There were other unintended consequences, as we know, but the fact is that a very motivated and then funded and armed insurgency basically drove the Russians out of Afghanistan. Obviously, the similarities are not ones that you should bank on because the terrain, the development in urban areas, et cetera, is so different. But I think that is the model that people are now looking toward.
Well, Rania, I'd love to know your reactions to Hillary Clinton saying that the model that people are looking towards, the U.S. government, and I think Hillary Clinton would know, and Western governments, towards a mujahideen-style scenario.
I mean, what she's talking about, with that little smirk on her face, by the way, like she couldn't look more excited. What she's talking about as the model with this Afghanistan insurgency in the 1980s that had what she called unintended consequences. What were those unintended consequences? That was the seeding of what became Al-Qaeda. I mean, that's the unintended consequence we're talking about here. And then she said that that's the model for Ukraine. What's frightening about that is not only are we talking about essentially the U.S. and all its NATO allies funding and arming an insurgency to fight the Russians in Ukraine, there's a few things that are dangerous about this. First and foremost, where would these people be trained and how would they get weapons? They would be trained in neighboring NATO countries like Poland, which is where they would also get weapons from through those countries, which opens up a new front in this war that could potentially cause an actual war across Europe. Because as we know, if Russia, which is saying any outside power that intervenes, we will attack you. If Russia really means that, that could mean Russia going to attack a NATO power, a NATO country, that could trigger Article 5, and you've got yourself a war in Europe. And that's just one of many dangerous ways that such a quagmire could play out. The other danger of that is, okay, let's talk about the Mujahideen. The most fanatical, ideological people are the ones who fight insurgencies like that. In the case of Afghanistan, it was religious theocratic fascists. The same, by the way, for the model that was used in Syria, which, the Afghan Mujahideen model was used in Syria. We saw how terribly that went over the course of 10 years. And so if we're talking about the context of Ukraine, who are the most ideologically committed people in Ukraine? They're neo-Nazis. So you're talking about potentially an insurgency that could and probably already is attracting neo-Nazis and the far right from around the world to come have a training ground where they can fight an actual war. And then you've got yourself a problem that we could end up dealing with globally, like we did and are still dealing with, by the way, with Al-Qaeda.
You know, I think that's a really good summary of, I think, the dangers of this, Rania. And the thing that really struck me about that, exactly what you're saying, is it essentially means, at least what Hillary is saying is true, Secretary Clinton, is that essentially the West has given up on the idea of a diplomatic solution here, and that they're just, moving now to an insurgency status. And, a number of people noted that about the State of the Union, that Biden didn't really make any significant calls for peace. I saw the New York Times reporting something similar as what Secretary Clinton was saying, that people are thinking about an insurgency. So you've got the NATO forces who seem to essentially now have, sort of rubbished it. And I brought up the State of the Union specifically because Biden had said, and this has been repeated in the British Parliament by Boris Johnson, that, that this was unprovoked. No one could have known this happened. Russia was, totally, rejected all diplomatic circumstances. So I did a little research, Rania, because I knew that people had been predicting this for some time. And I found a WikiLeaks, and let me use this as an opportunity to also say we need to free Julian Assange. You can see it there in front of me, but I just, wanted to raise this because and I'll just summarize it for you here, the WikiLeaks, that's the highlighted piece there. I won't read the whole thing, but what it comes down to is the U.S. ambassador in Moscow met with Sergei Lavrov, who said specifically, and the ambassador is also noting other people were saying this in Russia at the time, that if the eastward expansion of NATO took place, that it could rip Ukraine in two, start a civil war, and if that took place, it would force Russia to decide whether or not to take military action. So in 2008, it was 100% clear. You have the ambassador writing to the State Department that the top Russian officials, including the current foreign minister then, saying this could lead to Ukraine being torn apart and Russia taking sides and potentially military intervening, which is exactly what took place. And that to me is so important because it's sort of like, if there's a way out, if there's a way in, there was a way out. And there is a diplomatic way out, but it's just being rejected because it requires the United States and the West to give up on the, sort of imperial attitude towards Europe. And I'm sorry I cut you off, Rania.
No. It's interesting to me this suddenly happened out of nowhere. I mean, how long ago was I'm not the best mathematician, Eugene.
Yeah, I mean, I am not either, but it was almost 2 decades ago.
2008 was a long time ago.
Yes. Yes.
So the U.S. has been aware of this, and this is why we've been talking about this on, I think, every episode that all of our programs on Breakthrough News, that we put out on Breakthrough News on this issue. We've been pointing this out over and over again, and you've been really bringing this home as the idea that the answer here is not what's happening, which is to further militarize Europe, to put, pump more funding and weapons into NATO, but the opposite, to in fact dissolve NATO, because at the end of the day, that is the root of this problem. And this one WikiLeaks cable is one among many people saying over the years, this is the scenario that's going to play out if we continue down this path of NATO expansion and escalation. And it's exactly what happened. This did not happen out of nowhere. And it's so important for people to understand that. And it's not to say that there's no blame to be put on Russia for going through with this invasion. It's just to say that the stage was set by NATO and by the US. And now that it's set, and now that this has happened, exactly what's been predicted, what are they doing? They're escalating further, and it's terrifying because it's almost like we're this tiny little fish in like a sea, in an ocean of people who are screaming for more war and more escalation. And anybody who says the opposite or even questions it is like working for Putin.
That's exactly right.
That's the climate we're in right now.
That's exactly right. I mean, obviously, and we said this last week, it's not a question of supporting Russia invading into Ukraine. But it's, we have to talk about what it's going to take to have peace. And to have peace means that we can't take Russia invading Ukraine and say, well, that was wrong, and that means that everything that happened up to then is right. It means that everything that happened up to now brought us to a point of this tragic kind of happening because people were unwilling to listen to the calls for peace coming from civil society, coming from different governments in Western Europe and around the world to not, do this. And it's just really unbelievable that something that could be so predictably avoided is just not being avoided. And I think that if we don't focus now, those of us in the United States, those of us in the West, on what is actually going to get us out of this quagmire, and it's certainly not going to be escalating sanctions and escalating troops and sending in more missiles, and it's absolutely not going to be starting an Afghanistan-style insurgency. I mean, the things that we're thinking about here, as you know, Rania, I'm a Virginian, and the saying we have down there is, 2 wrongs don't make a right. I don't know if you have that saying in Northern Virginia, but just because you're angry about Russia invading Ukraine, it doesn't mean that the reverse is true, that the warmongering is true. But, one other thing go ahead.
Well, I think this is where you were going with this, but I also want to point out just with the whole idea of any voice that is against this escalation is somehow putting out Russian propaganda. It's also now becoming a situation of any voice warning about the objective reality of the neo-Nazi elements, the far-right elements. We're not saying all Ukrainians are neo-Nazis, but the fact that that element exists in the Ukrainian armed forces and the Ukrainian police is very important. And that now is being framed as something that's Kremlin propaganda, even though it's an issue that the mainstream media, the Atlantic Council, has reported on. People in Congress have noted this in limited weapons supplies in the past to Ukraine as a result of the inclusion of neo-Nazis in the Ukrainian military.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. The veneration of Stepan Bandera is probably the thing that's the most well-known. The Banderites who in World War II allied with the Nazis and, responsible for killing hundreds of thousands of people, Jews, Poles, Ukrainians, others, extraordinarily brutal stories of gouging people's eyes out and other things like that. And I just want to bring this up. A Zelensky quote. This is from Zelensky. And I just want to say for the record here, I do not view Zelensky as a Nazi, but I think just the fact that he says this speaks to the climate in the country that you have to say this. He's talking about Bandera, and he says, there are indisputable heroes. Stepan Bandera is a hero for a certain part of Ukrainians, and this is a normal and cool thing. He was one of those who defended the freedom of Ukraine. Now, obviously, Zelensky's a politician. I don't view him as a sympathizer of Nazis. I've never known him to do that. He's obviously Jewish, so I don't want people to think I'm accusing Zelensky, but I'm just trying to show the political environment in the country of Ukraine, that to be a successful politician, he felt he had to speak positively about Stepan Bandera, who was allied with the Nazis. He, was later put in jail, but his own forces, who started the UPA, an army allied with the Nazis, again, killed hundreds of thousands of people. And real quick, I want to play a clip that speaks to this. But before I do that, I want to bring up another quick screenshot if we can. And, I'm glad you brought up the point about Russian propaganda, because this next piece, which is about this Nazi group C-14 and the money they receive from the government, is from Bellingcat, which is like a CIA cutout. I don't know what else to call it, right?
I mean, literally,
and they're
people
reporting
who
on
have
this
called us
specifically.
Bellingcat hates us.
Yes, and I just want to quote from them. Documents analyzed by Bellingcat suggest that Ukraine's government apparently earmarked over $30,000 for projects by organizations linked to the National Corps and C-14. And those were actually educational programs. I'm not lying to you. Quote unquote patriotic education that was being carried out by people that everyone from, Bellingcat to the State Department to the OSCE considered to be Nazis. But before I get too carried away, I do want to play this clip. It's a little bit of a longer clip of this guy from C-14, a Nazi group, talking about the role of these far-right groups in Maidan, which I find to be quite revelatory.
Нам зараз надавали стільки зброї, не тому, що ми хороші, як нам кажуть, нам допомагає Захід, бо вони хочуть нам блага, тому що ми виконуємо задачі Заходу. Тому що ми єдині, хто готові їх виконувати, бо нам весело, нам прикольно убивати і прикольно воювати. І вони думають, вау, давайте вже подивимося, що це буде. Тому виник цей новий альянс, про який зараз говорять там Туреччина, Польща, Британія, Україна. Ми тут флагман. Тому що ми затіяли війну, якої не було вже останніх 60 років. Так от, уявіть собі, скільки в нас зброї, скільки в нас ветеранів. А це є, вже йдеться про те, що нові політичні альянси вже глобального рівня, нові політичні виклики.
Wow.
Yeah, that's just some of it. The whole thing is actually on YouTube. It just, I mean, there's so many different elements to it. Many of the things he says that, you know, having 8 to 10% of Nazis was enough to control the whole Maidan, and he's, you know, essentially mocking those who are saying, oh, it's only 8 to 10% of Nazis. You know, he's saying a lot of homophobic things. He's going on and on about how they have all these weapons. You know, I mean, it really just gives you a sense that these people are deeply embedded. So again, I think it's spurious to say Ukrainians are somehow Nazi sympathizers as a people. I don't think that's correct. I think it's unfair. I do not think that's the case for Zelensky as well, and I think, you know, including many of the people in his party. But there's just no doubt that in the police and in the military, a number of these Nazi groups, C-14, by the way, had a deal with the Interior Ministry to be part of the police. They're getting tens of thousands of dollars from the government to educate young people. You've got the Azov Battalion. You had the official National Guard Twitter, you know, showing that they were putting bullets in pig lard to kill Muslims from Chechnya.
Right.
So again,
Twitter had to cover it.
Yeah.
Twitter had to cover it as like something that was like evil. And you're not supposed to look at this.
Exactly. It's a tragic situation. And like I think we've said, like we said last week, like we said now, you know, I myself, even though it's hard for me to bring myself to condemn it, because I can see that NATO created this situation and set this up, basically, that it was guaranteed to happen. You know, I think that in many ways the invasion has been based on falsehoods about, you know, the so-called Soviet history of Ukraine and different things like that. I think that it's, you know, done a lot of negative damage in many ways to some of the broader anti-imperialist strictures around the UN Charter and how to, you know, control things and not just have a might makes right situation, but to be able to try to protect those who want to have an independent foreign policy. But we can't ignore the fact that the issue of far-right fascists being involved is real. We can't ignore the fact that the NATO push-up against Russia is real and is unjustified, and that it's the cause of it. And if we're not willing to talk about the hardcore right-wing nationalist politics, if we're not really willing to talk about what NATO did to essentially build the bomb, place the bomb, and light the fuse, we're never going to have peace. We're never going to be able to get out of this. And I think it's just unfortunate we're here.
Oh, 100%. And, you know, I have to say, with the way the media is covering this, it's quite alarming that they're doing these things where not only are they downplaying what you just described, they're also promoting, like Sky News did like an instructional video on how to make a Molotov cocktail. There's people like embedding, I'm not going to name names, but there's people like embedding with these militias and justifying everything they're doing and portraying them as glorious. And it's only going to get there's foreign fighters being encouraged by Western governments to go fight in Ukraine, which is so reckless. But also, who do you think is going to be the most ideologically motivated? I mean, for the last several years, the media in the West, liberals, governments have been warning about the threat of far-right extremism and far-right violence. This is going to be where those people go. We already know that Americans in the far right have gone and trained in Ukraine with these people. And that is only going to get worse. And how the media covers it is so important.
I agree with you. I agree with you 100%, and I'm glad you ended on that. It's a good segue to our first guest, good friend of the show, Kevin Gosztola, who's the managing editor of shadowproof.com, the curator of thedissenter.org, which, by the way, 3 people have told me in the past week they have started following thedissenter.org because of Kevin's last appearance. And he's also the co-host of the podcast Unauthorized Disclosure, co-hosted by Rania Khalek. Kevin, thanks so much for being back with us.
Hey, it's good to see both of you.
Great shirt, by the way. Kind of twinning a little bit.
Hey, we've got some balance in the frame.
Thank you. Well, sorry, Rhonda, I think I cut you off. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was giggling about the fact that you commented on Kevin's shirt.
Oh.
Guys,
I'm sorry. I know there's terrible things happening in the world. Like, the only way to get through it is to be able to laugh about these little things sometimes. So thank you for that.
Well, Kevin, I'm curious your thoughts about where Rania just ended, which is the role of the media during this conflict, the omissions, the things that have been said. I don't want to editorialize too much. I know you've been following very closely how it's been covered. How are you evaluating how the mainstream media is informing us about this?
Well, what I've zeroed in on is the complete and total disinterest and lack of coverage of the ceasefire negotiations and the effort to obtain some kind of an agreement. And I also think they've been very confusing about the way they present a ceasefire. I'm a layman, so maybe you're going to take issue with what I have to say, but I understand a ceasefire to come before a peace agreement. I understand a ceasefire to be you agree that you're going to stop bombing and attacking each other, whether it's your military forces that as an occupier or the forces that are being occupied have to come to an agreement first to stop shooting at each other. And then when you have that, then you can have the peace agreement. And there's been this way that the ceasefire negotiations are presented to say, oh, Russia still has military operations. Russia's still conducting strikes, which I think is just, it doesn't really match with what the definition of a ceasefire is. And so obviously you got to get to the table, and they don't really present to you what Russia's demands are, and they don't really talk about Ukraine. And the other thing is there's no real attention to the fact that, in my view, it doesn't seem like the United States has empowered Ukraine to offer anything to Russia in order to get them or an incentive to turn back, which I think is highly dangerous when we're thinking about all of the risks and the threats that you've run down. But I just will very quickly mention them again because I think that they have to be top of mind. The nuclear crisis, we are in a nuclear crisis. In fact, Vladimir Putin has already used his nuclear weapons because he threatened to use nuclear weapons. And when you do that, you are using your nuclear weapons. Daniel Ellsberg wrote a fantastic book documenting this history called The Doomsday Machine. And the U.S., this is how they use nuclear weapons. They'll threaten to use nuclear weapons. And when you do that, that has an effect. There are 15 nuclear reactors in Ukraine where there's fighting happening around these. And that is hugely troubling. We're seeing oil pipelines explode, gas pipelines explode. What kind of ecological devastation is occurring right now? Over 1 million refugees have fled Ukraine. All of this can only be stopped with a ceasefire, and yet the focus of coverage, when they even do mention ceasefire, is never even about the ceasefire. They talk about no-fly zones while they're covering the ceasefire, or they talk about whether Russia will even respect setting up humanitarian corridors if they, because that's something, some news we could actually report. They agreed between Ukraine and Russia during these negotiations to set up humanitarian corridors so that people can flee. And hopefully that makes it easier for people to get out of Ukraine who want to leave the conflict. But immediately, without any evidence whatsoever, they say, well, should we really expect Russia to respect these humanitarian corridors? And they don't come from an opposite angle, because here's the other way you could look at this issue. How fearful should we be that NATO might use those humanitarian corridors to get arms shipments into Ukrainians, which I think would be terrifying for the civilian population and would definitely mean that there would be no escape routes for people who want to get out. And some of these people who are students from other countries that have been trapped, I know there have been Indian students, Chinese students, others who study in Ukraine who have been killed in this conflict and are still trying to get out of the country. So those are just some issues to start with.
I'm curious, Kevin, also, there's another aspect of this war that's playing out now that's quite alarming, and it's the online aspect of it, which is the level of control that American tech giants are exerting at the behest of the American and European governments to shut down any media affiliated with Russia. And it's actually interesting. I'm not in Europe right now. I know RT has been banned at this point, both online, on YouTube, on broadcast, all across Europe, but I'm in Lebanon. And even in Lebanon, I didn't know this, Lebanon is apparently part of Europe, because in Lebanon, on Twitter, I can't access any of the different RT like channels. And I find that alarming because it's denying people access to the Russian side. You don't have to agree with it. You don't have to believe it, But it's important to be able to hear from all sides in a situation like this. And the US and Europe have just cut off the other side so that everyone is only in their countries, at least in Europe, are only dependent on them. But then what does this say also about the fact that this infrastructure to just take down international channels, it was already in place and able to be executed? What are the dangers here for free speech when we see this happening to huge media outlets, even if they're Russian?
Well, the obvious argument is the slippery slope, right? That it doesn't stop with RT and Sputnik and these other outlets that are funded by Russia's government. That anyone who's ever been a contributor who appeared on a show on any of these networks is maybe considered affiliated with those networks. You know what? It's easy to make lists of people's names and go after them in these times of panic. Historically, I mean, we're having a kind of Red Scare moment again right now. And it's far worse than what we saw during Russiagate, in my opinion, just simply because what we're seeing unfold involves the immediate loss of life that is being blamed, and understandably so, on Vladimir Putin. But then for those people who try to apply a historical analysis or contextualize what they're seeing, if it is not within a certain spectrum of debate, then they start to go through your biography. They start to look at your past writings and see, oh, okay, you might have sympathies, and then to label you. And the effort to label you is hugely disturbing when you look at what's already been done to people who are Russians within their country, and to think that that could be coming for people here in the United States, that you would be fired from your job for publishing certain pieces, or you would lose your access to work and have professional ways to expand your career because of things that you had expressed previously. I think that's hugely troubling to me. And then this idea that people who are into this media, who might contribute to this media, would be working for Vladimir Putin is just ignorant, because most of these people who have had anything to do with it, including myself, I've appeared on Sputnik shows. I don't get paid. I've never been paid a single time. And also, most of these shows that I've done are with people who are Americans who are doing shows that have no platform in the United States, like CNN, MSNBC, NPR, any of these radio stations, community radio stations, whatever. They don't have deals to appear on those airwaves, and so they've taken the opportunity to get on a radio by way of this mechanism. So I just think that's one clear point to make.
Mm-hmm. No, very, very well taken points. And I'll also mention our good friends at People's Dispatch, peoplesdispatch.org, writing a lot about this. I know starting today, but they've got a number of pieces on the media censorship angle that people should look for. But I think those points are so well taken, Kevin. And it just leads me to kind of the other sort of thing we're seeing about our side, the U.S. media, is this just, and UK too. I know I shouldn't be surprised by this, but just the racism of some of the coverage around, the victims of Ukraine, and because of their affinity to whiteness, or I guess being white, that somehow they're more deserving. I mean, I know people have told me before, they're like, why are you surprised? But it has been a bit shocking to see how open we've seen some of these statements being made.
Yeah, and I don't think I can top what Ali Abunimah did for Breakthrough News the other day with Rania in that conversation. I won't try to replicate and repeat what he said. I'll just encourage your viewers to go watch that hour-and-a-half conversation that he had, which I thought was very illuminating. I will say that I think the outrage to the way people have described, and particularly these anchors and some of these European officials have described the crisis and what they're seeing, it's had an effect in that CNN is now actually covering every hour the racism happening at the border. And I noticed yesterday that a European commissioner, when confronted, at first called it fake news. He called it fake news, that these reports about how people are being mistreated. And when CNN said, I'm paraphrasing here, but we have the receipts, we talked to people, we confirmed, then he backed down and just gave them the letter of the law and how people should be all treated fairly. But it's pretty incredible that the immediate reflex was to say, oh, that can't be true, which is exactly what you'd expect from the Russian government. I mean, that's what we've been trained to think, that everything the Russian government is lies. And I think one of the things that people should recognize here, I'm kind of veering away from the topic of racism. I'll get back to it.
No,
but just
please.
to make this quick point, that we've been led to believe that Ukrainians are less likely to lie to us than the Russian government. But we need to remember that in war, both sides of the conflict have incentives to not tell the truth, whether those are malicious or whether they are for good reasons. Both sides are going to cover up their losses. They're going to hide how badly the war is going for them. But that is not being truthful as well. So I just think we should be mindful of that. But the racism aspect, aside from what we've seen with the refugee crisis and some of the ways people talk about who is being targeted, we've seen this in the way that there's a reaction to alleged war crimes that have been committed in Ukraine already. Because in the coverage, they cover cluster bombs that are being used in Ukraine. But I think it manifests itself in a very racist manner, because there's no reflection on the fact that, okay, you're talking about bombs that are being used in Yemen by Saudi Arabia, and these are bombs that are manufactured in the United States. And the people who are victims there and who are being killed are obviously of a much different shade of skin. And so it becomes pretty evident why we care about certain casualties more than other casualties. The same goes for referring these war crimes to the International Criminal Court for investigation. And you hear that being talked about on some of these news channels in the past 24, 48 hours. And nobody mentions that the United States isn't a party to the International Criminal Court itself. And also, nobody mentions that they are not signed on to the cluster bomb ban themselves and have resisted it. And even 1 year into Biden's administration, yesterday, the Pentagon was asked, why are you not a signatory? And they were like, oh, well, we're still working on it, which is a horrible answer. And it's also a lie. You aren't working on anything. We haven't been a signatory of the ban, and we have no intention to become a signatory of the ban. The only time we ever stopped using cluster bombs was when it became a PR nightmare for the Obama administration. But as long as there isn't any blowback as far as our image goes, we're going to keep allowing our allies and our own troops to use these banned weapons.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I would just like to add that I'm in Lebanon, where in 2006, just before the Israelis stopped bombing Lebanon, the last thing they did was they dropped millions of, there goes my electricity. The last thing they did is they dropped millions of cluster munitions on southern Lebanon. Until this day, every year, several children die thinking that they're toys and picking them up. And there were never any repercussions for that. So there's also like a level of hypocrisy here, because none of these media organizations cared then. The U.S. government didn't care then. They probably supplied those munitions. So much of the outrage and hysteria that we're hearing, it's like no one's suggesting what Russia's doing is okay. But at the same time, it's like a fraction of what the U.S. does on a regular basis. So it's just, the hypocrisy is amazing.
It is. It is. Well, Kevin, we really appreciate you joining us here on the show. Shadowproof.com, thedissenter.org. I can't recommend it more highly. Obviously, Unauthorized Disclosure. I am a fan of that podcast as well. But once again, appreciate you, Kevin.
Well, keep up the excellent coverage, and thanks for giving space to people like us and these voices, and have a good rest of your stream.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, we want to move now across the pond, as they say, and I think, sadly, we're seeing some of the same patterns reproduced over there, but we have with us Robin Talbott, who is the chair of the Young Communist League of Britain. Robin, thank you so much for being with us here on the show.
Hi, good evening. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Well, I think you probably heard a little bit of our last conversation, and it seems that there in the UK, it's sort of a similar media environment where anyone who wants to talk about the roots of this conflict, to critique NATO, to oppose, escalation and sanctions, is just being, savagely attacked. I mean, maybe I'm wrong about that, Robin, but it does seem like you all are having to put up with a very similar sort of war hysteria.
Yeah, I mean, as a general rule, mainstream media does go along with the government's line on things, especially when it comes to foreign policy. Any discussions of foreign policy, NATO, even things like Palestine and Israel. You know, I know your speaker was talking about conflicts in the Middle East just then. Yeah, the mainstream media tends to follow the government position. So, for example, I'm not sure if you're aware of what's going on in the Labour Party at the moment.
Slightly, but I've seen some. Tell us about it. I mean, what I've seen is that Keir Starmer, it seems, is more warlike than the Boris Johnson.
Well, one of the curious things about the Labour Party is that it's so, you know, it's a party that says that it stands up for working people in Britain, but it's always, with its foreign policy and the way it treats international relations, it's always been very, very close to the British establishment. So it's not very surprising at all that at the moment the Labour Party is saying, you know, if you dare to sign this statement that's actually calling out NATO for its warlike position and contribution to the conflict that, you know, we see over recent years, I suppose since, you know, 1990, when NATO's moved towards Eastern Europe and consolidated its base there. So these Labour Party MPs who had signed a statement pointing out this fact of NATO's sort of dangerous expansion and so on, they've actually been threatened with the whip being removed in Parliament, and they'd be, you know, stripped basically of their Labour Party title.
And we've seen something similar with the transportation workers, I believe, there in London who came under attack recently. Is that the case? Yeah,
so recently there was an article published in Telegraph, which was attacking the RMT trade union on basically alleging that they had links with Russia or Putin or something like that. Obviously, it was a complete smear. And I think it was actually quite a cynical attack for, you know, the press to focus in on a unrelated dispute with workers who are basically fighting for protection of pensions, jobs, also for funding for the London Underground, because basically the London Underground tube in London is sort of under threat because it's lost quite a lot of money. Its future's a bit uncertain, I believe, since the pandemic. So the fact that they'd called this dispute, I think it's incredibly cynical and also pretty classic of British right-wing media to use this, you know, some other issue to attack them on this basis. Yeah.
Yeah, it's also the fact is that, you know, you guys seem to have, I think, worse than the U.S. In the U.S. right now, a no-fly zone hasn't really been pushed by, there's been a couple politicians, but they're sort of on their own. There hasn't been either party pushing that, the idea of a no-fly zone. However, it seems as though Keir Starmer is actually suggesting that Boris Johnson is too soft on this because he's not pushing for a no-fly zone. So is that actually something that is being discussed in the UK or promoted either among politicians or in the media as something the US should carry out, or the US and the UK and NATO should carry out?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure at the moment because at the moment, a lot of what I'm seeing in the media anyway is a lot of simply discussion of the, you know, the terrible crisis going on in Ukraine at the moment, the bloodshed and so on, and the humanitarian aspects such as refugees. A lot of that is in the media at the moment. I did read that Keir Starmer said that he would bring up the issue of a no-fly zone with the government, but I'm not sure whether there's really the appetite for, you know, from the public to get involved in a war like that, really, because it's a very dangerous situation we're seeing at the moment. I mean, a country like Russia that feels like it's got its back against the wall, it's not a situation we want to be involved in terms of conflicts. And obviously our position as communists is that we want a peaceful resolution to this conflict that minimizes the devastating cost to, human lives and well-being.
And then I'm curious about the left in the UK. I'm wondering, because I know a lot of the left in Europe is confused about how to feel like this. I've heard some complaints that people are now are becoming pro NATO as a result of this. It's becoming almost treacherous to suggest that perhaps we should be against NATO expansion or against NATO altogether. In the US, I think you're still allowed to say that on the left. Is there a climate of discussion around that among the UK left, or is a fracture developing like we're seeing in other parts of Europe?
Well, to be honest, I mean, I kind of mentioned it earlier when I was talking about the Labour Party and its historic sort of Cold War mentality. This is not something that's been in the Labour Party in history. Obviously, you also have the left in the Labour Party, and you have many good people in the Labour Party. But this is also a mentality, this kind of Cold War mentality, or mentality that tends to be aligned with the government's like imperialist perspective. That's something that you also see historically in the trade union movement and so on as well. So I think this is something we've been seeing for a long time, which is that there is quite a big and successful anti-war and pro-peace movement in Britain. But there's always been difficult discussions and arguments and disagreements and so on about how to effectively fight for peace and fight for things like peace, disarmament, and so on.
Well, one final thing I want to ask you here, somewhat prompted by your shirt. If I'm not mistaken, I think you got a Communist Party of Ukraine shirt on there. Great shirt. For people who don't know, Communist Party of Ukraine banned politically. But, one big topic of all of this is sort of the history and the legacy of the Soviet Union. We're in a moment, sort of the past few years, where many, many more people are looking for alternatives to capitalism. So I'm curious, from your perspective and the YCL perspective, I mean, how important is it to lean into these conversations around what the legacy of the Soviet Union is at a time where I think people are looking more and more about what the alternative to capitalism could be?
Yeah, so I think it is super important. You have to, as a socialist, as a communist, we have to talk about, all of the experiments in developing socialism that have happened around the world. And these have had amazing positive achievements, as well as negative things that have happened in developing socialism. But those conversations are so important because socialism achieved such amazing things. It achieved things like education, healthcare, rights for women, rights for young people. The idea that we could live in a society where we actually have access to a job, healthcare, education, somewhere to live. And often we could have those utilities for free or for very low cost. And actually we have the ability to, do the work that we enjoy and live the lives that we enjoy. I think that is a really powerful and amazing idea. And it's a lot of work has to be spent, unfortunately, in cutting through, this kind of propaganda about the history of socialism. That is, basically tried to rubbish it as much as possible. And we also have to link these things, though, and I think it's even more important to do that. You have to link these things to all of the issues that are so important right now. We've seen a terrible decline in standards of living in Britain. Many young people are burdened with debt. They can't find work or productive work that they want and that they want to enjoy doing. And the future does look quite bleak under capitalism, not to mention things like the climate crisis and so on. So these ideas of socialism, a society where, we can live in common and share the wealth of society in common. It's a really amazing and wonderful thing, I think.
Mm-hmm. Well, Robin Talbott, Chair of the Young Communist League of Britain, really appreciate you giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks very much. It's been a pleasure to be invited here and to speak to both of you. And I'd just like to say solidarity to all the people who are fighting for peace, and also to our comrades in Ukraine. As you mentioned, I've got a Communist Party of Ukraine T-shirt. Thank you very much.
Right on.
Bye-bye.
No, thank you. Yeah, very good point. And Communist Party of Ukraine banned, criminally, quite frankly, in my view, very relatively popular party there in the UK and in some parts, Ukraine, and in some parts of the East, over a fifth of the voters voted for them, but, they're not allowed to participate any longer because of the anti-communism from this post-Maidan government, really. So
those are the Western liberal values we're fighting for in Ukraine.
Well, I want to run through a few super chats we've had here while we've been waiting. We got Danny, shout out to you, saying Zelensky, kind of both sidesing it, referring to the Bandera quote we read earlier.
Yeah,
Connie
good.
making a very good point here, saying let's not forget the war is also a push for Western and specifically American control of Russian oil and natural resources. Obviously they've taken significant aim at the natural resources there in Russia, and we see all the calls coming from the Congress in America to, try to cripple the Russian oil industry so the American oil companies can take over the world. Serge making a very interesting point here, saying, according to the New York Times, people who fled to Russia are migrants. Only those who fled to the EU and NATO countries are refugees. Interesting point. Thank you for that, Serge. And thanks, everybody. And then Donnie Nunn also donating. No, shout out to you.
Don't read it.
Yeah, we're not. I appreciate the donation, but I appreciate the levity there. But no, I mean, so much that can be said. I just want to say, Rania, I've got some breaking news for you here. The Biden administration has formally asked Congress for $10 billion in emergency humanitarian defense aid for Ukraine. That's $4 billion than what they had initially been asking for. It's some weapons and things like that. Some of it's humanitarian assistance.
I like the word humanitarian thrown in with the word defense, which doesn't actually mean defense, but okay.
Yeah, quote unquote
Jesus.
Defense. As I think Tupac famously said it, it's been said many times before, they got money for war but can't feed the poor. I mean,
because you know where that money's going. You know where that money's going. It's going into the bank accounts of the executives of Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and BAE Systems. And oh wait, that one's British, right?
Well, BAE Systems is British, but they do a lot of things for America, but there's also Boeing.
Well, I'm just saying America first here is probably going to be. It'll be like
you
first
watch Biden State of the Union and you're like, buy American. Buy American.
Buy
Other people said they're going to do
weapons.
it. We're going to do it. It's just, are you really?
Right.
Go get
it. No, but
it.
this is actually quite depressing because that's pouring fuel on the fire, and then they can, it's gonna worsen whatever humanitarian crisis they claim to be trying to solve. With that.
Well, let me read you this. Going back to the point you were making earlier, Rania, about the insurgency and that Hillary quote. Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut, this is going to be a multi-year humanitarian nightmare, and we also have to be wise to all of the asymmetric threats Russia is going to levy at us. So I would argue to go big. And Michael Waltz, never heard of him, but he's a Republican from Florida, says, quote, Zelensky needs more ammo now, and that now is in all caps with a question mark. And I think we've seen sort of similar things from Democrats so far. I was looking for something else. I'm quoting here from NBC News. President Joe Biden faces growing calls from fellow Democrats to ban imports of Russian oil as lawmakers desperately try to find a way to stop President Vladimir Putin's bloody war in Ukraine. I mean, I'm not saying that it's not a bloody war in Ukraine. I'm not saying that Russia didn't invade, but just the framing of that. I mean, how many American invasions are framed like that by NBC News? But Senator John Tester, Democrat of Montana, said it's so obvious we need to cut it off. I wonder if there's a reason we haven't and what the hell the reason is. So that's John Tester of Montana seeming to suggest perhaps that Biden is captured by Russia or something, and that's why we haven't destroyed Americans' pocketbooks at the gas pump.
You know what's amazing about all of the, nobody cares about the repercussions of all of these policies because, the vast majority of the world where they get wheat from, especially the developing world, Russia and Ukraine. I'm not trying to make Lebanon the center of our conversation tonight because I know I continually bring it up, but it's an example.
You do live there. It's okay.
I do live here. And it is an example of a country that gets the vast majority of its wheat from Ukraine and Russia. And those prices have already skyrocketed. nobody's really paying attention to this. The price of wheat has gone up dramatically because of this crisis, also because of the sanctions that the U.S. has placed on Russia, which is going to make the purchase of that wheat more difficult because of the financial transaction that goes into that. And it's just, Lebanon is a poor country. It's going through this economic collapse, which we've talked about on the show before. It's going to struggle feeding its people now. Moreover, Lebanon lifted fuel subsidies because of the economic crisis. The government's no longer able to subsidize fuel. So fuel has already been unaffordable. Even for me, fuel's too expensive. I need it just to power the generator in my building. And the price of oil, because of this crisis, because of the sanctions, and everything that's happening is going to go up. It already has, and it's going to go up further. And that's for poor countries. This is also going to be felt in richer countries as well. But just imagine what it's going to mean for poorer countries. And we know that the U.S. specifically said that the sanctions, or some politicians have said that they hope to see the sanctions on Russia actually negatively impact other countries that the U.S. is also sanctioning, like Venezuela and Cuba. To those countries, Russia has acted as somewhat of a lifeline. They've given a lot of humanitarian aid to Venezuela and Cuba because of how much suffering has been inflicted on them as a result of U.S. sanctions. And that's going to disappear because now Russia is being sanctioned in such an extreme way that they're not going to be able, they're going to need humanitarian aid.
Well, you know, we
this is
saw a
just a
White House
disaster.
official actually say, I believe he was speaking to Voice of America, but I could be wrong, but it more or less said part of what they're hoping for is that the repercussions go on Cuba, go on Venezuela, go on Syria. I mean, they were saying this openly as essentially collective punishment on those countries for daring to have relationships with Russia. And you'll remember, Rania, when we were in Ethiopia, and we'll actually still have some more to put out from that trip that speaks to this. You know, a program that they have there in Ethiopia, they have a big factory to provide cheap bread to working class people there in the capital of Addis. You know, a chunk of that wheat is coming from Ukraine. I mean, they're trying to grow more and more in Ethiopia, but they are bringing in some wheat from Ukraine. So, I mean, it's pretty obvious that people around the world...
It's like a breadbasket for a significant portion of the world.
Egypt,
so,
you know, you got Ukraine and Russia now. The prices are not only going up, but you're not going to be able to ship as much out. You know, and I think people think about this whole airspace question. They don't really realize, I mean, if the people flying things from place to place, the shipping going through certain areas, you know, not only is it an issue of the prices, it's an issue of the logistics. And, you know, aluminum, also a major thing that's produced there in Russia. You know, aerospace technology is produced in both countries. Coal, which is, you know, I know we're not for coal, but, you know, it's still being used in many countries around the world to power things. I mean, I think the price of coal is skyrocketing because of this. And so, you know, when you really look at it, I think the impact of these sanctions, not only is it, as all sanctions, mainly going to hurt ordinary Russians, but I think the boomerang effect of trying to remove Russia from the global economy on, you know, working and poor people around the world is going to be much worse than is being.
No, people are going to go hungry. People are going to go hungrier than they already are. And one last thing I just want to note real quick, because you did mention Zelensky, is I think that people, and someone was saying this to me earlier today. It's interesting because Zelensky was an actor. He played the president,
a comedian who becomes
TV.
President.
And I hope I'm not starting a rumor, but the person who told me this is a person I think knows what they're talking about. The person who helped write the scripts is actually a speechwriter now.
Oh, interesting.
And that's interesting. I have to look into that if that's true or not. But if it is, it just makes it more interesting because I think Zelensky is doing quite a job playing this kind of performance role for his country. He's doing it for, you know, his country, whatever. But people need to remember that this is a performer.
Yeah.
And he's lobbying. He's doing like the performance of his lifetime. He played a president on TV. Now he's playing one in real life. And he's doing a fantastic job performing and getting emotions high. I read an article in the New York Times about one of the things that changed the minds of a lot of European leaders about things like SWIFT, right? There was a lot of leaders who were against removing Russia from SWIFT, about that and a few other things like certain weapons that they had to sign off for, particularly the Germans, to give to the Ukrainians. One of the convincing factors, I'm sure the main convincing factor was U.S. pressure, but another one of the convincing factors is Zelensky called into one of their meetings and gave this performance. He gave this speech about, we're fighting for European values. Like, we're at the forefront of fighting for your values, and Europeans love that stuff. They like really like they started, and the New York Times was quoting people who were at this meeting saying they started crying. Like, Volodymyr Zelensky had European leaders in tears. And that's, I mean, the role he's playing is going to be written about in history books. He's probably going to win prizes because he's also like a fever dream of the Atlantic Council. But the point is, people really need to be a little bit more skeptical about this guy that's being promoted around the world as like a global hero. Because he's a performer.
Yeah, the Ukrainians have great comms. There's no doubt about that. I think our previous guest, Kevin Gosztola, spoke to that in a war, all sides, have a huge impetus to either lie or decontextualize something or misrepresent it. I mean, it's obviously the famous quote, truth is the first casualty of war. And I think anyone who's been paying attention to this on social media, you've already seen, a lot of things are being walked back, a lot of things are being debunked. So I think everyone should take it with a grain of salt. I will note, in Russia, you cannot access Netflix anymore, but if you have access to Netflix, you can see Zelensky's show there on Netflix if you're curious in watching the show.
I've seen a few clips on Twitter.
I watched the show when he got elected. I'm not here to give a media
Was it good?
criticism. Yeah, it was good. It's funny.
Okay.
It's a good premise, I mean, it's sort of was bizarre to see it kind of happen in real life. That's why I watched it. I was like, wow, this is so real. And I know more clips are circulating, but let's not get off on TV criticism. But for those who are interested, you can see it.
We'll do another stream. We'll do another stream solely
on Zelensky's TV show. Let me stop. Let's just move forward here, because I think the real question that a lot of people are asking themselves is, and we've been sort of underlining here, what do we do about this? How do we address this? And I want to talk about building an anti-war movement in the United States with those who are doing that very thing. Very happy to be joined by Walter Smolarek, who's a national organizer with the Answer Coalition, and a good friend of the show, Kym Smith, who's an anti-racism and anti-war organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation, based in South Carolina. Walter, Kym, thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, Kym, let me start with you. I mentioned that you were in South Carolina, not just because I love South Carolina, but specifically because your senior senator, Lindsey Graham, is like one of the most warlike individuals in Congress on this and other issues. And, I just wonder, I know you all are working there in South Carolina to build resistance to escalation by the United States. How are you talking to people about this conflict, why it matters, why they should do something in a context where I'm sure a lot of the leaders in your state are, really going overboard in promoting an aggressive U.S. policy?
Yeah, I had to stop myself. I promised myself I wouldn't roll my eyes too hard when you mentioned Lindsey Graham's name, but I failed. Yeah, I think it's really important to honestly, when we talk about war in general, war impacts everybody. Rania, you talked about earlier how it impacts Lebanon and how these sanctions impact Lebanon. And like just bringing it back to just good old South Carolina, like we have one of the largest training bases in the country at Fort Jackson. We train the most soldiers, and so much funding goes into our military apparatus here that's being taken out of our communities. And I think talking to working class people, and when we talk to people about that, I think the biggest thing is to tell them like, yo, this money should be going into our communities. This money should be going into education. We should not, and I talk about this with you, Eugene, all the time, we should not have a quarter of shame in South Carolina where people don't have educational standards at all. We shouldn't have areas that don't have running water. But Lindsey Graham wants to continue this propaganda and put in warmongering and doesn't want to meet the people's needs here. And like the people are gonna suffer. And I think starting with that, when we're doing, trying to build an anti-war movement or build up the anti-war movement, because it's always been an anti-war movement. But like, as we build it up, just letting people know like, yo, this is coming out of our communities. This is coming out of things that the people need, our basic needs. And I think that's just a great starting point.
Walter, let me ask you this sort of related question, because I think, when we're talking about this issue, what people I think are saying is, do you oppose what Russia did? Do you support what Russia did? And that's the whole sort of substance of the conversation about what should be done. And I think subsidiarily, it's sort of like, if you don't aggressively go out and say you oppose it and foreground that somehow you're acting in a traitorous way. So I wonder just how you're responding to that question when you were out with the Answer Coalition, also working to try to raise awareness about how we got here and, you know, how a lot of the solutions to you know, resolving this mean no escalation from the United States.
Yeah, well, I think it's a huge, absolutely essential task of the anti-war movement to explain to people that this conflict didn't just begin a couple of weeks ago or a couple months ago. I mean, in a way, this has really been building for like 25 years. When NATO began its eastward expansion following the collapse of the Soviet Union, absorbing more and more formerly socialist countries in Eastern Europe, including some former republics of the Soviet Union like Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania. That's really where this conflict began, and it's the consequence of decades of NATO aggression finally boiling over. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to defend the decision of the Russian government to invade Ukraine, certainly not. But it's so essential to get this context out there because the US corporate media is just a nonstop propaganda machine for the Pentagon and for the State Department. And so I think that's really our task here to explain that. So there's the issue of NATO expansion in general. And then there's what happened in Ukraine specifically. In 2014, in February 2014, there was a coup in Ukraine. The elected government, corrupt but elected government of Yanukovych, was overthrown in a US backed color revolution. It involved neo-Nazi elements as essentially the sort of fighting vanguard of that coup. And that is what began the civil war inside of Ukraine. I mean, people in the east of the country initiated an armed struggle in the wake of that takeover. That's how you get the creation of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. So this was a long time coming, a long time coming. And this war would not have happened if NATO, and particularly the United States, agreed to cease its expansion and provide basic security guarantees to Russia. For instance, pledging to not station advanced missiles inside of Ukraine. And we should also note that the United States in recent years withdrew from two crucial arms control treaties, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty and the Open Skies Treaty. That also sent an unmistakable aggressive signal to Russia. I mean, all of these facts are so important. I think getting them out there as aggressively as we possibly can is really the central task at this moment of the U.S. anti-war movement.
What are, I'm curious, the biggest challenges with this particular current crisis, and how does it compare to trying to organize against past wars? I imagine one of the challenges is that the role of the U.S. is much more hidden. The role of NATO is hidden. For as far as the media landscape, it looks like, you know, if you're watching CNN or reading the New York Times, it's all Russia invaded Ukraine. It stops there. And so I imagine when you're talking to people and you're trying to organize against escalation, I imagine that's probably one of the challenges. No?
Oh, I think so. Yeah, I mean that's a big part of the challenge here. I mean, it's different than say in Libya, where it was the United States going in and dropping the bombs. To explain this requires, I think, a lot more historical context. But there are certain basic things that I think remain the same. I mean, the point that you all were making before that, you know, this is a war for the profiteers, for the military corporations. You know, all of those things remain fundamentally the same. But yeah, I mean, this explanation, I think, requires a lot of persistence and patience with people. You know, I think it'll become clear though how reactionary, anti-worker, and just generally, you know, militaristic this whole war drive is. You know, it's not simply about coming to the aid of the embattled Ukrainian people trying to defend their democracy. It'll become clear, I think, as this goes on, that this is part of a grand strategy, a much broader strategy by the United States to militarize Eastern Europe, to increase their troop presence there, to station advanced weapons inside of Europe, and to generally try to dominate the region and to dominate the globe. So I think we need to stand strong in these sort of initial, more difficult days, and keep building that movement over the long term.
You know, Kym, one question I have for you that when we're talking about war, we're always talking about propaganda. We're talking about framing, the enemy politics. And I wonder, someone like yourself who has done so much organizing around mass incarceration, around racist policing, how it hits you to hear sort of it's like a democracy versus authoritarianism. And, America's good because we're a democracy. Russia's bad because they're totalitarian. Maybe I'll just stop there. But I mean, how does that strike you as someone who's done so much around the police state?
I think I just have to, sometimes you gotta laugh to stop from crying because it's just like, yo, we want to talk about a dictatorship. We want to talk about, first of all, good old South Carolina. My grandparents are survivors of Jim Crow fascism. And my great grandparents lived through that. Rest in peace. So first of all, if we want to talk about a dictatorship and we want to talk about authoritarianism, we need to look at the U.S. need to put the mirror on themselves, right? During the 2020 George Floyd uprising, I saw tanks. I saw militarized police on protesters who were doing nothing but protesting for human rights, protesting for basic human rights, not to get shot by cops. And they were sending out gas cans and tanks and tear gassing people. And they were using the same tear gas canisters that Israel uses on Palestinians. So we want to talk about it. Let's talk about it. And when they want to talk about Russia is this and Russia is that, coming into International Working Women's Month, the Democrats didn't even pass the Women's Health Protection Act. It didn't have enough votes. So we're still fighting for bodily autonomy over here. We're still fighting for basic health care because abortions are health care. We're still fighting for people not to be incarcerated. The U.S. incarcerates children. Our juvenile justice system is ballooning with kids. Little kids are in cages. We see our elders are locked up that can't even get out. Our elders are dying from COVID inside prisons. We have people who are going against psychological warfare and torture being in solitary. So I just think it's just ridiculous that the U.S. can paint Russia as this, the big bad Russians, which is just totally anti-communist propaganda, and not even take a second to look at what U.S. does to Black people in this country and poor people in this country, and just the horrible conditions that people live in that there is no excuse for.
I think that's a very good point, and I think we also saw this in terms of the criminal charges that they were giving people there during the uprising, right, Kym?
Yeah, exactly. Being a part of the Soda City Bail Fund, people were getting hit with felony charges. We had people who were just out giving water to protesters and would get arrested and get a felony charge. People's lives were ruined for protesting. People, this showed up on someone's record that they had a felony for disturbing the peace and, assault to a police officer. And that person was literally just giving out water to protesters.
Wow.
That's it. And his life is ruined.
It is interesting how, and I'm not saying this is the reason why the U.S. is escalating. Obviously, it's a benefit, but it is amazing how overnight all of the issues that you just brought up, whether we're talking about racist policing or mass incarceration, or the fact that like 1 million people have died preventable deaths from COVID, which the U.S. completely failed at containing. The fact that Joe Biden has completely failed to pass any of the supposedly progressive ideas and policies that he campaigned on implementing. The fact that like our government has been a complete failure as more Americans fall into poverty because they couldn't renew the child tax credit. Like all of these things were piling up. This administration was completely unpopular. And now overnight, the conversation has changed. And it is incredible how beneficial war is on so many levels, because then everything else takes a back seat, including all of the issues that you're talking about. It just gets papered over. The fact that there's people still facing criminal charges from protesting, which we're supposed to celebrate when Russians do it, but in the US, it's like a bad thing. That's more of a comment than a question, but I'm just curious, like, does when this kind of war situation, this climate of a rush to war takes over, does it impact the ability to organize around these other issues?
I think in some ways it does. I think it does sometimes impact the way we can organize around these other issues because people are so brought in by that U.S. propaganda sometimes that they forget about the war taking place at home, and they're so focused and like get caught up in this like media campaign that the U.S. has going because the media, not y'all, we love y'all, shout out BT News, but like the usual capitalist media literally puts out all of this propaganda just to get American people to focus on it and forget about these other issues sometimes. But luckily, we're in such a great, I feel like, phase in the movement and the struggle that people aren't forgetting about it. People aren't like, I was so happy when, Biden had his State of the Union, not that I want to hear him talk, but the response and people were calling out those contradictions and calling out, yo, you didn't talk about student loans. Yo, what do you mean we're past COVID? People are dying still. And it was just such a good space. It was a good place to be in. And it shows how forward this movement is going.
Mm-hmm. Well, Kym, I know you have a lot going on, so we're going to let you go here and not take more of your time, but I just wanted to really appreciate you. That's Kym Smith, longtime, strong organizer on almost all the important issues to working class people in South Carolina with the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Walter, stick with us. I know you're going to stay around. We're going to add a guest here who we're very, very honored to have with us on the show, Austin Gonzalez, who's a member of the National Political Committee of the Democratic Socialists of America, joining us here on the Freedom Side. Austin, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I am very happy to have you. And, DSA, you all have come out, you put out a statement regarding the war. The White House was attacking you. And I want to get into some of that, but I don't want to be guilty of many of your critics, which was to caricature your statement. So before we get into it, what did DSA put out? What have you been saying about this conflict?
Absolutely. Thank you, Eugene. There's so many things to unpack here. I'd have to say during my entire time in leadership within DSA, this is the first time the White House has attacked us directly, which to me is a disturbing sign of how jingoistic things have become, right? And unpacking the statement that we released itself, right? Our statement condemned the Russian invasion, right? In very strong terms, right? What seems to have bothered people is our rhetoric referencing NATO expansionism, right? Which to me is an impossible part of this entire scenario to ignore, right? It's been shocking to me, honestly, to see how many people I've seen outright defend NATO, right? Talk about how, well, no, NATO's role in this is important in protecting people. I'm just like, excuse me? We are in a very, I don't want to get too hyperbolic here, right? But I feel like we're in a very dark place when we're seeing leftists or whatever we want to call it defending NATO, right? I thought anti-NATO was a very run-of-the-mill position for any sort of socialist, right? For any sort of anti-imperialist, right? And something I like to say is you can't call yourself a socialist if you're not an anti-imperialist, right? And if you're going to be an anti-imperialist, that means opposing NATO. So I was very proud to see my organization, Democratic Socialists of America, forcefully reject both NATO, reject the invasion from Russia, right? I think it's very important to talk about these situations with context, right? And not to look at these sorts of situations so binary, right? So black and white, right? Like it's amazing how many people I see that are like embracing these weird like World War II like Sudetenland fantasies. I'm just like, do you guys know what's actually happening here, right? Have you been following this situation at all before the last 3 months? But yes, it was remarkable to me to see even the White House coming out and attacking DSA. But once again, as a member of a socialist organization, I lean on the great socialist Eugene Debs himself, who very proudly stood up against World War I, which I think is important for any socialist to do.
Well, oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, on top of the White House rapid response guy attacking DSA, there's also been a couple think pieces from various outlets. I know recently today it was all on Twitter, New York Magazine. Someone from New York Magazine came after DSA, which was interesting because I don't think anybody was quoted from DSA, just the critics were quoted, which included, like, I think the New York Post was one of the outlets that came after you and attacked you. But it does seem like, we're always told the left is so irrelevant in the US. They don't even matter. DSA is so dumb. It doesn't even matter. It has no power. So I think it also speaks to some level of power or fear of power that the left does or can have in the US that someone from the White House felt the need to attack DSA, that so many different outlets feel the need to try to police the left's position on this issue. And, I'm the biggest pessimist in the world. So when I see a glass half full, it means something. But I'm curious your thoughts on that. Do you think this speaks to some level of perhaps, power that the left has, maybe more than it thinks it has, if a DSA statement can cause this much controversy?
I 100% agree with those sentiments, Rania. And I've even told a lot of my fellow DSA members, right? To me, it's exactly what you just said there. This is a sign of our power, right? And not just DSA, the movement, right? This is a sign of the power of the movement, the importance of what you guys do, right? Here with Breakthrough News, right? I feel like during my entire time as a leftist, as an anti-imperialist, I've seen a real blossoming of the movement within the last 5 to 10 years, right? And the liberal media, whatever we want to call it, is taking notice. Literally, the White House is taking notice. To me, that is absolutely a sign of our power, right? And to me, I look at that as not. To me, that's why I say getting attacked, that isn't the time to now hide from our anti-NATO position. No, that's when we double down on it, right? That's when we tell people why we're anti-NATO, right? Which is in the DSA national platform, I should say, right? U.S. withdrawal from NATO, that is, right? This is an important time to educate people on NATO, right? When people are actually paying attention to what's happening here, right? And because we have this power, this platform, because people are attacking us, it's because of that platform, right? Because people know, oh, there's an actual movement here raising awareness on NATO, right? Referencing NATO's crimes in Libya, right? We saw what happened 10 years ago, right? You're trying to tell me that NATO intervention is going to help the Ukraine? Are you serious? Like, this is why I say, like, it's amazing to me how many people, and I try not to get too cynical, right? You refer to yourself as a pessimist there, Ronnie, right? Try not to get too cynical, but the amount of people I've seen in the last 3 months have very strong opinions about NATO and everything that I haven't seen them ever express before is very curious to me. But once again, getting to the central point here, once again, I think this is absolutely a sign of our power, but not just DSA. Like I say, the whole greater socialist, anti-imperialist movement, whatever we want to call it. I think it's so critically important for us to be coming together right now because I expect the attacks to just increase. They're not going away anytime soon. These attacks are going to escalate, right? And it's going to be critically important to be being there for each other, to be amplifying each other's messages and making sure that people are not being singled out as pro-Putin, whatever that means. It's once again, the word shocking comes to mind, that any sort of criticism of NATO is interpreted as, oh, so you're pro-Russian fascism, whatever that even means, right? This has literally nothing to do with Putin. This is about recognizing that NATO expansionism brought us to this point unequivocally. Even the DSA International Committee put out a couple of tweets earlier today referencing how this position that NATO expansionism was going to provoke a response from Russia is something that was maintained by some of the most hard-right intelligence analysts during the 90s. This is nothing shocking or new or radical. It's a basic fact. But yeah, that's some people struggle to accept that, it seems.
You got that right. That's for sure. And we still have Walter Smolarek with us from the Answer Coalition. But I certainly comment on whatever you like, Walter. But I mean, I'm curious your thoughts on a similar point that it's possible to walk and chew gum at the same time. We can have a sophisticated analysis that touches on a number of things, but it's also possible to build real opposition in this moment to escalation. We don't just have to despair.
Yeah, I think that's completely true. That's completely true. And it's more important than ever because this is such an unbelievably dangerous situation. I mean, this involves the two main nuclear armed powers in the world. I mean, even though it's a difficult moment right now for the anti-war movement, it's also a crucially important one. And I completely agree with the points that Asim was making. I mean, the idea that somebody could consider themselves progressive or even a socialist and think anything positive about NATO whatsoever, just it's shocking, right? I mean, NATO was a military alliance that was conceived, founded in order to annihilate socialism militarily. I mean, that's what NATO was all about. It was so that when World War III comes around, I mean, this was the founders of NATO's thinking. When World War III rolls around, all of us major capitalist world powers need to be on the same team to destroy the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons. And it maintained that offensive character all throughout its existence, including after the fall of the Soviet Union. I mean, of course, it's a big part of this great power competition strategy that the Pentagon has, which says that, China and Russia are like the number one targets on our hit list. And it's also been used to, inflict horrific suffering on the peoples of the former Yugoslavia, of Afghanistan, and most recently Libya. And I think that's another important point that Austin raised. I mean, if anybody thinks that NATO intervention could possibly have a positive or progressive outcome for a targeted society, look at what happened in Libya. That was sold to the public in a lot of similar ways, right? Like there's a besieged people. There's this horrible dictator Gaddafi, and he's going to massacre his own people. And we, the West, NATO, have a responsibility to protect. And what was the consequences? I mean, there was a horrific war, and the fabric of Libyan society was so shredded that, I mean, even the slave trade reemerged in Libya. I mean, it was an unmitigated disaster for the people there, and that's been the case anywhere the United States or NATO or any of its junior imperialist partners have intervened. Nothing that they do will make the suffering, will lessen the suffering of the people of Ukraine or bring desperately needed peace to the people of Ukraine. Actually the only thing that the United States could possibly do to improve the situation is make an ironclad pledge that NATO will not expand anymore, or better yet, abolish NATO altogether. I mean, that's the only contribution to peace that the United States could possibly make at this moment.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to ask you both a question. Walter, I'll start with you since I have you here. I think the rumor is that President Biden is going to ask for $800 billion for the Pentagon this year. I think he sort of set the stage for that with his State of the Union speech. I mean, talk about this. Again, Walter, I'll start with you, but I want both your thoughts on this. I mean, what is the impact of this kind of spending on working class people in this country? I mean, when people hear these huge numbers, I think it can seem kind of abstract. But what does it really mean to spend $800 billion on the Pentagon in 2022?
Oh, it's a disaster. It's an unmitigated social disaster, both for the people who are on the receiving end of those weapons and for people here in the United States. I mean, there are so many crises working class people are facing: the lack of affordable housing, the lack of good schools, lack of health care. The basic material things that you need to live a life with dignity are denied to so many tens of millions of people inside the United States. And yet there's $800 billion. When you add everything together, everything that's hidden in other parts of the budget, it's really more like $1 trillion or more than $1 trillion just in 1 year, on things that have no value other than being used to destroy and kill people in other countries. It's completely a shock and an outrage. The Biden administration had this like Build Back Better social program expansion that they wanted to do, and it fell apart, right? And by the way, I mean, this was another thing that I was thinking about when we were talking about the White House's attack on the DSA. I mean, they had nothing but positive things to say about Joe Manchin, the guy who sunk their domestic policy, and yet they feel the need to attack the DSA. I mean, it shows how aggressive they are when it comes to targeting the left, and how completely nonchalant they are when it comes to going after the right. But anyway, I mean, I think that the social costs of this society economy based on militarism are enormous, and ending that militarism would have huge dividends, not just for the peoples around the world who would get the U.S. boot off of their neck, but also for working class people here who would not have to foot the bill for this horrific blood-soaked empire that's in every corner of the world.
Austin, I'm curious your thoughts about the same question. If it does turn out to be true, the impact of this just unbelievable militarism, $800 billion potentially for the Pentagon.
No, that's a wonderful question there. And I'm going to echo a lot of the sentiments already said. But one thing I would just want to say at the top about this important question is this: why I say to see so many liberals, leftists, progressive, or whatever we want to call it, coming out and being pro-NATO is a gift to the military-industrial complex, right? It's a gift, right? This gives them that mandate, at least in their heads, to do things like this, right? And say, oh, well, you see, the people are demanding it, right? No, they love our bloated military budgets. These are good things, right? So it's once again, it's disastrous to see that sort of rhetoric from as many people that I've seen it. But getting to the crux of this issue, right? I just echo a lot of those sentiments, right? Like, the more bloated our defense budget is, right, the less there is to spend on social programs here in the United States, right? A point I love to make to a lot of my friends within DSA or within the movement or wherever is that we can't ever expect to get to a place where we can have fully funded social programs for the working class, such as Medicare, until we take apart our defense budget fundamentally, right? As long as we're pouring so many resources into this, it's going to make it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to even have those sort of fully funded social programs. Those conversations are directly linked. They're directly linked, right? Which is why I say you cannot be a socialist without being an anti-imperialist, right? You cannot help the poor if you are not first attacking the empire, right? The empire which is funded by the United States, right? Which, as mentioned, has its boots on the necks of people across the world, right? It's shocking to me, once again, that word shocking, right? It's shocking to me when I see how much rhetoric or in this case, funds could potentially go to the Ukraine. What about Yemen? What about Afghanistan? We've just moved on completely. Who cares, right? Just let those people suffer, right? There's a reason, right, why these budgets get inflated, right, and why no sort of conversation is ever made about how we're going to help the people in Yemen and Afghanistan, because once again, those are the people whose boots we have on their necks, right? So like it's once again, it's stunning to me to see people move on from those conversations and zero in on this conversation in the Ukraine, once again, as if these are isolated incidents, right? When they are all connected, they're all related to each other. You cannot have success or freedom for one sector of the working class and completely ignore others, right? The working class is international, right? And unless you're actually uplifting the international working class, which includes Ukrainians, which includes Yemenis, which includes Afghans, which includes people here in the United States, it's not proper socialism, right? Which is once again why socialism and anti-imperialism are intricately linked.
And also includes Russians. And that's something that is like, I mean, obviously, the people who are experiencing the most immediate impact of what's happening right now are Ukrainians, because that's where this war is happening. But the US has just unleashed a massive campaign of economic warfare against Russians. And they're openly saying it. They're openly saying that, like you heard Hillary Clinton openly say that, unfortunately, Russian people are going to have to suffer. I'm paraphrasing, but that's almost exactly what she said when she was talking about the necessity of these sanctions. And so, I'm curious how you perceive people reacting to the issue of sanctions as well, because it's one thing to say let's not give weapons here and there and add fuel to the fire, but we've seen in the last 10 years or so that sanctions have become the primary weapon of US empire against so many countries. I think a third of the world at this point is impacted by US sanctions, if not more, now that Russia has been put under such extreme, economic strangulation. But do you guys find, I guess, in the kind of work that you do, I know, probably for you, Austin, it's more on a political level, and Walter, it's more on an, organizing level. But do you find the issue of sanctions being something that people are receptive to? Maybe I'll start with you, Austin, in terms of politics, since DSA does end up endorsing politicians. Is this an issue that you find potential candidates being receptive to having on their agenda as something that they will adamantly oppose?
Another wonderful question and a lot to unpack here, right? First, I just want to make clear that anti-sanctions language is also in the DSA national political platform, right? But the sad reality when dealing with the US government, when dealing with politicians of the United States, is that a lot of people are backward on this issue, right? And not just this issue, foreign policy in general, right? Referencing the military industrial complex, they run DC, right? They absolutely run DC. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that aspect, and a lot of work that we've begun to do in that aspect to get people to forcefully oppose sanctions in DC more often, because I think it's important to point out that sanctions don't work, right? Sanctions don't work, right? Even quote unquote targeted sanctions. I love that phrase. It's hilarious to me, right? Sanctions don't work, right? Sanctions are, no matter what phrase you want, no matter how many adjectives you want to place in front of it, sanctions are designed to hurt a country's economy, right? And what does that mean? That means it's going to hurt a country's working class. And what does that mean? That you're starving poor people, right? And not only are you starving poor people, if you hate Putin so much, right? Hey, I'm no fan of Putin, right? You are only emboldening people to his cause, right? You're only furthering people to say, hey, yeah, it is the United States that's choking us. That's messed up, right? If you actually want to help the Russian people, right, or do whatever, right, sanctions are only going to make the situation worse, right? And especially in this situation in particular, I see the call for sanctions or target sanctions as deeply irresponsible, right? This is a heightening of escalations. Sanctions are an act of war, right? We're talking about endorsing acts of war during this situation. What we should be calling for is diplomacy, right? De-escalation, not escalation. And sanctions only make these sorts of situations worse, right? So sanctions fundamentally are an act of war and should be, once again, should be opposed by any actual principled anti-imperialists.
Walter.
I'm curious, Walter, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one thing I would add to that is that, sanctions aren't an alternative to killing people. That's something that I think that's, a persistent myth that's put out there by people who are really for U.S. imperialism, but just a softer, gentler form of U.S. imperialism. Sanctions absolutely kill people. I mean, you can die because a bomb is dropped on you, or you can die because you can't access essential medicine that you need to stay alive. I mean, the outcome is the same. Sanctions are completely brutal. We can see what happened to Venezuela, for instance. I mean, tens of thousands of people have died by some estimates in Venezuela because of the economic blockade imposed on that country by the United States, and using its position on top of the world capitalist system. Wall Street reigns supreme over almost every other sector of the economy in the United States and around the world by leveraging that power, that unjust, ill-gotten wealth that they've accumulated to cause suffering and deny essential goods to people around the world. That's, in a way, that's just as cruel as shooting a missile at somebody or shooting somebody with a gun. I mean, it's something that can be, absolutely deadly on a massive scale. And if you are, as one should be, right, repulsed by the idea of the violence of warfare, the human suffering that it involves, you should be just as opposed to economic warfare, popularly called sanctions.
Well, certainly well taken points on both fronts. I can say that for sure, but I really appreciate both of you joining us. It was a pleasure to be able to have this conversation. Austin Gonzalez of the Democratic Socialists America, Walter Smolarek of Act Now to Stop War and End Racism, also known as the Answer Coalition. Thank you both so much for giving us some of your very valuable time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, Rania, amazing guest all around, and thanks again to everyone we've had, Austin, Kym, Walter, Robin, Kevin, you as well, Rania, you're not a guest, but it was great to be here with you as always, so I'll thank you as well for just being here.
Can I just want to tell you, someone made a comment. I almost did a screenshot, but I couldn't because we're obviously doing a live stream. But someone made a comment when you made the comment to Kevin about his shirt. Someone made the comment that those shirts are all Eugene's, or are all the pleasures Eugene's about the shirts or something, and it made me laugh. I thought you'd appreciate that.
Yeah, I saw Danny Hui also threw in a couple more bucks. Appreciate that for sure. Andre making a point, closing down the media as undemocratic. We were talking about before, and I think that's certainly, very, very relevant and very, very crucial. We mentioned a couple other countries. I also want to mention South Africa. This is a major issue right now. DSTV took off RT because of European sanctions, but, people live in South Africa, so, people are paying hundreds of dollars for these cable packages and not getting what they want. South African National Editors Forum has protested, but, something else to watch on the censorship front and how what happens in these first world countries, is so relevant, even to people who technically, quote unquote, are unaffected. But yeah, so much to cover here, so much to say. I mean, I just, briefly, Rania, I do want to plug it. You tell us a little bit about a couple of the interviews you've already put up from Dispatches on this conflict, because you've done a couple very recently that I think are important for people to watch.
Yeah, so this week I had the pleasure of speaking to Boris Kagarlitsky, who is a Russian leftist. I gave a really interesting interview because I think it's important to hear from all different viewpoints on the left of this issue. One thing that we all agree on, regardless of whether we're not in perfect agreement, is that we don't want to see any more NATO expansion. We don't want to see any more escalation. We want this to end. We want this war to end, and we want an end to NATO. I think that's those things we can agree on. And then there's a few divergences elsewhere, but regardless, one thing I appreciate on Breakthrough is I feel like we've definitely been able to have a diversity of viewpoints among people who agree with those core issues. And I think it's important to speak to Russian leftists in particular, because they're a bit fractured, just like the Western left is, on how to deal with this particular invasion. But I think a lot of them are against it. And it can be hard to hear from Russian leftists sometimes because they have a more distinct and harsh critique of their government, as they should. It's their country, they're leftist, and their government is not a leftist government. And so I got to hear from him some kind of how about Russians are thinking about this, dealing with this internally, how they're affected by the sanctions that are already impacting their economy and devaluing their currency and causing all kinds of chaos inside Russia, and how he thinks this might play out, and why he thinks Putin did this. And while he, of course, believes that NATO aggression and expansion, this was kind of like an inevitable thing that happened, he also gave some context about internal reasons, domestic reasons, why Putin chose to do this. And I thought that was quite interesting. So I encourage people to check that out. And then me and Ali Abunimah of the Electronic Intifada did a live stream that I think was really important because, I look at Ali as a voice of wisdom, and a very consistent voice of wisdom on all kinds of issues when it comes to foreign policy and anti-imperialism. And it was the kind of voice I think a lot of people wanted to hear from and needed to hear from, because he really explained not just the roots of this crisis, but also made some parallels to the kind of hysteria and climate of fear that we're living under right now, that the media and our governments are creating with the anti-Russia hysteria, the drive to more war, and really like what needs to happen to avert it. And so I encourage people to go check that out. And I've got, a couple, another interview coming out. People might like it, people might hate it. But again, I think we do need to hear from lots of viewpoints. But that said, I also want to encourage people to go back. I mean, one thing that I've really appreciated about the coverage that we've been able to put on Breakthrough is that, we have a weekly episode of the Socialist program hosted by Brian Becker, that we air on Breakthrough. And Brian has been hammering on this issue since I think 6 or 7 weeks ago, maybe 2 months ago, when it started to escalate, but not as many people were paying attention to it. It was kind of happening in the background. And you've been on a lot of those episodes, Eugene, where you and Brian have given so much historical context and also adding and articulating, leftist theory on how to understand this in the right context, and really offering so much historical context, not just from 10 or 20 or 30 years ago, but even 100 years ago. So I also encourage people to go back and watch those episodes from 2 months ago, from 5 weeks ago, from 4 weeks ago, from this week, because it's really helpful. And I think there's a real hunger for people to understand how we got here. Mm-hmm. And that's my spiel.
Well, it's a great spiel. Also, shout out to Tafari, sending us some solidarity, sending you some solidarity back. Thank you so much for your donation. As always, this will bring us to the close. Don't forget that you can go to patreon.com/breakthroughnews, patreon.com/breakthroughnews, become a patron. Everyone who is a patron, shout out to you. Your ongoing support, crucially important for us. Everyone who's going to become a patron to you, shout out to you in the future. And you, of course, can also go to breakthroughnews.org, make a one-time donation, which we also appreciate as well. And, of course, if you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to hit subscribe. Also hit the bell so you get the alerts. And we'll continue to bring you as much coverage on this and other critically important issues moving forward on Breakthrough News. But that'll do it for us here on the Freedom Side. And as always, we'll see you next week.
Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.